are working on taxes know that those where most of the questions arise from policymakers, from your legal counsel, from stakeholders, from your coalitions and others. And it's where I've done most of my work as well. So what this guide is really an examination of all of those pressure points or those policy levers that you really need to account for when you're thinking about crafting a tax ordinance or a tax bill. What the guide is really our attempt to reach out to those experts across the nation that you saw on the previous slide and get their input on all of these policy decisions to try and come up with best practices or sort of consensus around what we should be looking for in a strong tax ordinance. We've had many bills introduced over the last decade or so, both locally and at the state level, and those have been great to see how people react to different types of policy levers. But we've had relatively few experiences with actually seeing how they play out in practice. We have a few good chances to do so now, especially with the tax in Mexico and the one in Berkeley, but we haven't had many other opportunities to do so. So this was really our attempt to gather the expertise from around the nation on this issue and to get their input on these different policy levers. We attempted to make them best practices from a public health perspective as much as possible. Most of the legislation that has been introduced and gone through the process, as all legislation does, tends to get amended, revised, in many cases weakened, so the final product is not as strong as it was when it was first introduced. So these best practices that we're talking about here are really best practices in many cases from a public health perspective, although as you'll see when Jim and I go through the remainder of the slides, you really can't divorce the political and administrative considerations sometimes from the actual public health considerations. They're just too closely intertwined, and that'll become evident. What the guide is not, it's not legal advice, it's not political strategy of any sort. It's really just a discussion of the national experts on a number of issues that are commonly included in a sugar-sweetened beverage tax. Go to the next slide, please, David. So I'm going to start with the first one slide previously, David. I'm going to start with the first policy lever that we identified, and then we're going to go through them one by one. And the first one is simply what type of tax are we going to be looking for here? And this discussion usually boils down to either an excise tax or a sales tax. Sales tax, I think, is fairly common to everybody on the call. It's a tax that's imposed on consumers. It's calculated as a percentage of the retail sales price and collected by retailers from the consumer at the time of purchase. So when you go to your local grocery store, you buy a number of items. Many of those are subject to a sales tax. The sales tax is computed as a percentage of the price of those taxable items. You don't see it on the shelf. You don't see it reflected in the actual shelf price of the item. And in many cases, you're not even sure what items are subject to the sales tax. An excise tax, on the other hand, is a tax imposed on businesses for the privilege of conducting business, any business, such as selling sugary drinks or selling tobacco products. And if you think about public health taxes, alcohol taxes, tobacco taxes, those are excise taxes for the privilege of selling those products. And they are specifically imposed on the businesses, the sales of the products. Well, there's been a lot written about this topic, sales tax versus excise tax, and in fact, there are numerous states that already impose a sales tax on sugary drinks sold at retail or sold in vending machines or both. And those are generally not considered public health taxes for the most part. When we're talking about a public health, strongest public health tax possible, we're usually talking about an excise tax that's imposed on businesses selling sugary drinks. And imposed at a sufficient amount so that the tax will be included in the price of the drinks. In other words, it will be passed on down the distribution chain and included ultimately in the shelf price of the beverages in order to increase the actual shelf price of the beverages, which may have an effect on consumer behavior. If it's high enough due to price elasticity and consumer demand, a certain amount of consumers will choose not to purchase the beverages because of the higher. In reality, oftentimes at the local level, the choice between a sales tax and an excise tax is political and as well as a legal choice, because local taxes, local governments only have the authority to tax to the extent that the state has granted that authority. And in some cases, states have granted very broad authority to local governments to tax. In other cases, a local government has to go to the state legislature for specific authorization for every tax it wants to impose. So that's just a political and a legal reality that in many states we have to deal with. At the state level, we have much more latitude because states basically can impose any type of tax that they want so long as they follow the correct procedural requirements and the tax doesn't violate the Constitution. So to sum up, there's a lot of information there. It's in more detail in our guide that we put out, but if at all possible, the best practice recommendation from the panel of experts was an excise tax is preferable, but if the excise tax is not feasible, then a sales tax is definitely preferable to no tax, especially if either or both the tax is high enough to actually raise the price of the beverage in consumers on the shelf, or also importantly, if a portion of the proceeds from the sales tax can be dedicated to health initiatives such as chronic disease prevention. We'll talk more about earmarking the proceeds in a moment, but that is the best practice recommendation from the panel on the type of tax. And I believe we're going to stop here at the first time to see if there's any questions about this before we move on to the next policy lever.
We haven't received any chat requests for asking a question. We'll hold for just a minute longer to see if anybody has a question.
Yeah, and as David said, please do use the chat box to type in your questions. We'll be stopping after some of the different policy decisions to take your questions, and if there's none, then we can move along to the next topic, which is for Jim.
Okay, David, next slide, please, David. So the next question that comes up as various jurisdictions have considered the type of tax they want to draft. By the way, there's some people I think who might mute themselves. I'm hearing some background noise that might make it easier for the rest of us to hear if people could mute themselves while they're listening in. Thanks. So one question that always comes up is what type of beverages to tax. And there's a range of beverages that have added sugars as a constituent. And so the question is, which of those are the ones that should be subject to the tax? So at a minimum, we recommend that a set of sugary drinks that includes caloric sodas, such as Coke or Pepsi and so on, sports drinks, fruit drinks, energy drinks, sweetened teas and coffees, and syrups and powders be included. And let me go break through this in a little bit more detail. The basic starting point is thinking about all non-alcoholic beverages with added caloric sweetener, and then thinking through, are there any things that you'd want to exempt from that category? Now, kind of a no-brainer on this is to exempt medically necessary beverages and infant formulas, and those are pretty much all excluded from all tax proposals. Alcoholic beverages with added sugar are also excluded because those are usually regulated under separate tax code in every state, and so they wouldn't be considered as part of a sugary drink tax bill. I think there seems to be general consensus that the top of this list are beverages that deserve to be taxed because the evidence for their adverse health effects are well documented, and there tend to be little or no other additional nutritional value to these products, and they add a significant amount of added sugar to the diet. Where things get a little bit dicier and more controversial is the two categories of 100% fruit juices and flavored milk. The challenge with both of these categories is that, unlike the other types of products above, they do have some additional nutritional value. Juices have lots of other nutrients in them and phytochemicals and antioxidants. Flavored milks are an important source of calcium, particularly for children, and calcium is nutrient of concern is identified by the dietary guidelines for being underconsumed. So let me consider each of these separately. The challenge is that there are free sugars or not added sugars, but free naturally occurring sugars in fruit juices. And the question is whether clinically and bioclinically do these free sugars that are found in fruit juices act the same as the added sugars that are found in manufactured products like sodas or sports drinks. And here the science is not really clear, and that's why this always comes up as a point of discussion. There is very limited evidence, actually, that fruit juices are associated with adverse health outcomes, whether it's weight gain, diabetes, or heart disease. And so that's hence the controversy. However, from a conceptual, theoretical perspective, many people think that, well, a sugar is a sugar, and so it should be acting the same whether it's occurring naturally in the product as in a fruit juice or added in the manufacturing process. Healthy Food America is actually conducting some research in terms of doing a systematic review of the scientific literature, and later this year we'll be preparing a report that will summarize the current state of knowledge about fruit juices. Stay tuned. But for now, our recommendation is that this needs to be discussed on a site-by-site basis based on the best available evidence, and each site will need to weigh in its own mind the pros and cons about whether to include or exclude fruit juices. In practice, all the tax bills that I've seen that are being developed this year for potential action in 2016 are excluding fruit juices. They are excluding fruit juices and a sugar-sweetened beverage and are not taxing them. Flavored milk presents a slightly different issue. Flavored milks have both naturally occurring sugars in milk called lactose, and that's not a health problem. But the flavored milks include high fructose corn syrup and added sugars, and the anticipated effect of these would be the same as if you add them to a soda. However, because of the protein and because of the calcium content, many people would argue that on balance, it's good for kids to be drinking these drinks because it gets the calcium and the protein they need, even if they're taking in a little bit of extra added sugar. However, this is obviously quite an area of controversy as well, and we will also be sponsoring a systematic review of the health effects of sugary milk products to see if we can summarize the state of the science and see if it lets us reach any more definitive conclusions. Currently, the leading guideline in this area is from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they recommend limited amounts of sweetened milk consumption as part of a healthy diet for kids. Again, this becomes a local decision as to which products to include or not include in the sweetened milk category. I would add that there's a political consideration as well in that in sugary drink tax campaigns, the Dairy Council, which is a very powerful political group and has comparable clout to the American Beverage Association, has not been engaged because their product has not been subject to taxation. And so to add it to the list of tax products raises the potential of increasing the involvement of the stakeholder in opposition to the tax. Another question that comes up is what to do about powders and syrups. Syrups come in several types. One is the types that go to restaurants, which then get reconstituted with carbonated water to produce fountain beverages. Other types of syrups are those that you see at Starbucks, the flavorings that are added to coffee drinks. Other syrups might be even the ones that you use at home. Same with powders like Nesquik and other powdered drinks as well could be considered. The recommendation of the panel is that syrups that are used by a formula to produce a sugar-sweetened beverage like the soda in a fountain would be subject to a tax because there's an exact precise formula that is followed by the restaurant, and so you know what a given volume of syrup turns into in a given volume of soda, and then it's easy to develop a formula to tax that amount of soda or syrup. However, when syrups are added in a place like Starbucks, the quantity and the type of syrup can vary, and it can be customized, and there's no standard dilution formula, so it makes it much more difficult to figure out a uniform tax mechanism for that. And so the recommendation is to not include those syrups at this point. They also contribute a very, very small portion of added sugars and to beverage consumption as well. And then the final recommendation on this is not to tax syrups that are used in the home and syrups or powders that are used in the home, again, because it's not clear what the precise formula would be for developing a tax on those, and they contribute relatively negligible amounts to the total volume of sugar consumed through beverages. So, David, you see there's some questions that came up in relation to the slide, so I'm happy to take those now.
Yeah, you addressed one of them, but another one comes from Allison, and her question is, what about functional beverages like kombucha?
So I think that's a good question. Functional beverages like kombucha would be included if they have significant amounts of added sugar. That raises an additional point which I'd like to make, which is that many jurisdictions that have considered taxes have put a threshold value of how much sugar needs to be in the beverage for it to be considered a sugary drink. This amount has varied in different proposals. It could be 25 calories per 8 ounces. It could be 40 calories per 12 ounces. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, through the Healthy Eating Research Program, convened an expert panel in 2013, and they recommended no more than 40 calories per container as a threshold, which it comes out to about 2.5 teaspoons per container. So in that case, some of the kombucha products don't have enough added sugar to then count as a sugary drink, and some products do. And I think this speaks to another point, which is worth noting, is that there's a wide variety of products out there that are constantly changing. When a jurisdiction considers which products to include and where to set the threshold, it's worth looking at what's available in your local market to understand what products would not be included in a tax if you set a threshold of value there. David, were there other questions in relation to this? Otherwise,
not on that topic. We'll have some others later.
Okay, then I'll turn it over to Ian for the next slide.
Thank you, Jim. And I did note there are some other general questions in the chat box that we will certainly address at the end of the presentation relating to some other topics. So next slide, please, David. The next topic that we get a lot of questions on and generated some great debate on the expert panel is defining the tax base. And that is the basis upon which the tax will be calculated, or in other words, how are we going to measure the tax? And there are really two approaches here to consider, we think. And let me start with the one that has been probably the subject of the most research and the most literature, and that is a tax based on the volume of the beverage, which is on the right-hand column there. And typically those are taxed penny per ounce, for example, or 2 cents per ounce. And it has been the most common approach so far, and as I said, it's been the most researched and written about as well. And the volume-based tax has certainly a number of advantages. The primary advantage is that it's very easy for everybody to understand, both the electorate and the legislators themselves, and it's very easy to administer. It's very evident how many ounces are in a given beverage, and therefore it's very evident what the tax would be based on a container of the beverage. The other way to measure the tax, which is just starting to be the topic of more discussion lately, is taxing based on the actual amount of sugar in the beverage, whether you do that by the number of grams of sugar or the actual number of teaspoons of sugar, which is 4.2 grams in the beverage. Generally speaking, the panel decided that from a public health perspective, it was more rational to tax based on the sugar content. Because when you're taxing on the sugar content, you're making a higher tax for the beverages that have more sugar, which makes sense because the higher the sugar content in a beverage, the more deleterious the health effects are. Whereas the volume-based tax, it's really an all or nothing approach. It could be a beverage that has a lot of sugar or a beverage that has a low amount of sugar, and it's taxed the exact same amount based on how many ounces there are in the beverage. One way to mitigate this is actually something Jim just mentioned, is that some jurisdictions set a threshold for the amount of sugar that makes a beverage subject to the tax. And that's one way that if you have a volume-based tax, you create some more rationality in the tax. So if you set a threshold that beverages below a certain sugar amount will not be calculated as included in the definition of SSB, and therefore not taxed, then you mitigate some of the effects, the irrationality of using a volume-based tax. The other thing to note here is that the administration of the tax is a very important consideration for deciding which one of these to use. As I said, the volume-based tax is very easy to administer because it's very easy to understand, whereas the sugar content tax is slightly more difficult. And by that I mean most of the beverages that will be subject to the tax, which Jim just went through, will have nothing but added sugars, and therefore you can look at the nutrition facts panel and find out how much added sugar there is in the beverage, and therefore what the tax should be. But for beverages that have both added sugar, you can look at the total amount of sugar in the beverage, and all of that will be added sugar, and therefore you know what the tax rate should be. But for beverages such as fruit juices and flavored milks that have both naturally occurring sugars and added sugars, it's a little bit more difficult to parse out which of the sugars are naturally occurring and which of the sugars are added. If the FDA includes added sugars on the nutrition facts panel, this will be a lot more easy to discern. And if you are actually exempting flavored milks and fruit drinks from your tax, then this is really not a concern, because all of the beverages that will be subject to the tax, the total amount of sugar on the facts panel will be nothing but added sugars, so you can tax on the added sugar content completely. But nonetheless, even with all of that, the tax collection department will likely have to develop procedures or a list in order to create the tiers that are necessary to understand how much tax is imposed by how much sugar is in the beverage. So this is really final comment on this slide, which Jim will talk about in 2 more slides in more detail, is how much revenue will be raised by each approach. And you can see a chart that's from the guide that we put out. The chart is on the bottom that shows the tax based on amount of sugar and the tax based on volume. And depending on where you set the tax, either one could be higher. In this case, setting the tax at 1 cent per teaspoon for beverages versus 1 cent per ounce, and often, in many cases, the 1 cent per ounce was higher than 1 cent per teaspoon, but you could always set the amount, the sugar content tax a little bit higher in order to get the desired effect. So to sum up, the best practice recommendation from the panel of experts was that the tax on amount of sugar in the beverage made more sense from a public health standpoint, but there are many other considerations such as political considerations and administrability that make a volume-based tax a reality for some jurisdictions. So I will stop there, and I think Jim's going to take the next.
Just a quick reminder to mute your phones if you're not one of the presenters. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please, David. So I'm going to pick up where Ian left off and talk about defining, once you define the base of the tax, you have to define how much you want to tax, or what is the tax rate. Before I go there, I wanted to add one more point to what Ian was saying, is in addition to public health considerations and political and administrative considerations, you're going to also want to check with your local municipal or state tax attorneys to understand if there are any legal implications of choosing to tax sugar content versus the volume of the beverage. In some places where we've done some legal research, we found that the attorneys have opined that a tax based on volume would be less vulnerable to legal challenge by industry than a sugar-based content tax. And if you're interested in that, we could talk about that more offline, but that it's worth talking to your local council about the notion of what tax base should be. So moving on to the tax rate, there are 2 main implications of what setting what the tax rate does. One is it obviously determines how much revenue is going to be raised from a tax, and the second is it determines how much the price will potentially increase, and therefore how much of a disincentive that will be to purchase soda and its effect on consumption rates. First, thinking about the revenue, by using the tax base and the tax rate and knowing the volume of sales in a jurisdiction, which are available from several commercial databases, the potential revenue is fairly straightforward to calculate. And this is of obviously intense interest to all the stakeholders who are very interested in how much revenue will be generated and then to what good purposes that revenue could be used in a community. As many of you are aware, the Rudd Center at University of Connecticut, in conjunction with University of Illinois in Chicago, have developed a tax calculator which predicts and estimates the revenue based on 1 cent per ounce tax in all states and multiple jurisdictions, local jurisdictions across the United States. And this is a good first place to step to guess about what revenue might happen if a tax were identified and raised in your jurisdiction. If your site is not listed on the Rudd Center, you can contact Healthy Food America, and we can talk about how it might be possible to get an estimate for your jurisdiction. The next question then, besides the amount of revenue that's going to be raised, is what will be the impact of a given tax rate on consumption? And there's no simple answer to this question. There's lots of economic modeling that has been done to say if you raise a tax by 10%, you should expect to see a reduction in consumption of about 10 to 12%. So that's called price elasticity. And it translates that if you had a 20% tax, that you expect to see a reduction in consumption of about 20 to 24%. Then knowing that how consumption responds to price increases, then the question is how much do you have to reduce consumption to have an impact on some of the health outcomes that we're all concerned about, such as diabetes or obesity. There we have the advantage of having some economic models, such as those produced by the Choices Project at the Harvard School of Public Health. And by creating a computer simulation model of the effects of price changes and taxes on consumption, they estimate that you probably get a decrease in obesity rates, for example, somewhere around 1% to 1.2% if a 10% tax rate, penny an ounce tax were imposed on sugary drinks. So that's a ballpark estimate. Now, a 1% change in obesity rate might sound like a small number to some and a big number to others. For a public health, population health perspective, that's a large change in a major health outcome like obesity spread over an entire population. So that would be a significant public health impact. I'd like to talk a little bit about as well that it's worth your while if you're considering doing a tax in your jurisdiction to understand what the prices are of your local products, to understand what the impact is of a 10% increase or a 20% increase on price, or 1%, 1 cent tax or a 2 cent tax. Let me skip to the next slide, and then I'll come back to this slide, Dave. If you could just skip, I'd like to talk about this a little bit. We have some data on the next slide. If you look at this slide, you can see that we've listed several products here. The top chart, let's focus on that, which looks at what the impact would be of 1 cent per ounce tax or a 2 cent per ounce tax on various sugary drink products in terms of the percentage tax increase. Now remember, the target that we're seeking is around a 20% increase in the price to have a significant public health impact. If you look at the 1 cent per ounce tax on some Coca-Cola products or sugary drink soda products, you'll get to only about 11% increase with a penny an ounce tax, whereas you'll get to the 20% mark if you put a 2 cent per ounce tax on that product. However, on others, like if you look at the 2-liter size of Coke, even a 1 cent per ounce tax will give you a very substantial increase in the price if it's all passed on to the consumers. If you look at a drink like an energy drink, however, which are quite expensive per ounce, then a penny per ounce tax is going to give a proportionally smaller increase in the price, only around a 5% tax increase if you have a 1 penny per ounce tax on that. So what we found talking to people around the country is actually the prices of sugary drinks are quite variable from community to community. And it's important actually to go out to the supermarkets and the convenience stores and do a little price audit to kind of understand what the impact of a given tax rate would be on the prices of products in your community. It's also important to think about what the political and public relations impacts would be. For example, if you just look at that Coca-Cola 2-liter line there, 72% increase in the price of a 2-liter bottle of Coke at a 2-cent per ounce tax. That might be viewed by some in the community as way too much of a tax increase and might generate opposition to a tax. So I think here another point to think about is when you're thinking about what kind of tax rate to set in your policy, polling your community to understand what the impact of different tax rates would be on support for a tax measure is probably pretty critical to do. And then framing it both as would you support 1 cent or 2 cents an ounce, and would you support a tax that raised the price by X% versus Y% would be important consideration. It's interesting that most of the polls to date of taxes have asked respondents whether they would favor a tax of 1 cent per ounce versus 2 cents per ounce, and not much difference in the level of support for the initiative. But what hasn't been tested is translating those into actual price increases. Okay, go back to the previous slide, please. So the other important issue there about setting a tax rate, though, is to consider the issue of tax pass-through. And pass-through simply is if a tax of a penny an ounce is levied, for example, on a product, will the price of that product be increased by the distributor and then by the retailer by the full amount of the tax? So would the price of the beverage go up by a penny an ounce, or would it be only partially passed through with the distributor and or the retailer absorbing some of the price or spreading it across the whole product line so everything goes up somewhat, and so the tax is not selectively being resulting in price increases for the taxed sugary drink? And that's a real issue, and the industry has raised that issue. We now have some empirical information from both Berkeley and Mexico to see what happens if the full price or the full tax is passed through to the price. And the work of Jen Falb and her colleagues, and also Lynn Silver and her colleagues, have explored this issue in Berkeley and have found that overall the tax seems to be passed through by about 50 to 60% in Berkeley, meaning that when you put a penny an ounce tax on the product, the price of the product is going up by about 0.5 cent to 0.6 of a cent per ounce. Soda's a little bit more, it's about 70% is passed through. Other drinks a little bit less, in the 40% range, and it varies actually from where the drinks are being purchased from, etc. In Mexico, however, which is a tax on a whole country, the tax rate's being passed through at 100% rate. So I think that shows that when you have a larger jurisdiction, there's less opportunity perhaps to manipulate the amount of tax that's being passed through. Finally, I'd like to end here by saying that it's prudent to automatically adjust the tax rate for inflation so that the tax keeps up with inflation. All right, next slide, we'll skip 2 slides and then I'll pass it off to Ian.
Thank you, Jim. And I want to just, before I start the next policy lever, I want to talk about something that Jim mentioned, which is consulting with legal counsel. And I neglected to mention early on that that's one of the important considerations, especially for local taxes, but also for state taxes, that you really want to engage with legal counsel that's familiar with municipal finance laws in your particular state, and do that early on. The tax laws touch on a whole lot of different areas that we're talking about here. Jim mentioned one of them, but there are others that might be implicated, and really it's a state-specific legal analysis. So that's an important point to keep in mind, that you do want to engage with legal counsel as well as your tax department, in addition to your public health stakeholders and legislators as well, just to make sure that what you want to achieve is feasible in your jurisdiction. I'm most familiar with the tax laws in California, where we have a very Byzantine structure for taxes that has come about over the last 40 years through voter initiatives, and hopefully it's not as complicated in other states, but I know that It's a state-specific inquiry. So now let's move to the next consideration. We're almost done with the policy levers, and this is which businesses are required to actually pay the tax. Now, when we're talking about which businesses, we are only talking about excise taxes because if you recall, sales taxes are always imposed on consumers, so the consumer would be the one paying the tax. But if you're talking about an excise tax, you have a couple of choices about who should be required to pay the tax. And primarily that comes down to a choice between retailers, the businesses that sell SSBs to consumers, or distributors, the businesses that distribute the SSBs to the retailers. For states, most of the tax legislation that we've seen would impose the tax on distributors, which is not uncommon for this type of tax, as the distributors are most often the entity that's required to pay tobacco taxes in most states, for example. But for a local jurisdiction, it's a little bit trickier consideration. To start off with a basic premise, local governments can only tax businesses that are quote-unquote doing business within their geographic boundaries. And that can be open to interpretation what doing business is. If you want to tax retailers at the local government level, then you tax all the retailers that are physically within the boundaries of your local jurisdiction, and there's no question that they are subject to your jurisdiction and doing business. Distributors are a little bit different and require a little bit more analysis. But we believe that you can define distributor as making a transfer of a product within the jurisdiction and therefore, quote unquote, doing business within the jurisdiction. This is an important point also to consult with your legal counsel on as well, because some sugar-sweetened beverages are transferred by quote unquote common carriers, which are not businesses that are linked to any specific retailer or distributor. They're simply trucking businesses that truck different types of goods and drop them off at different locations. So you want to make sure that you define distribution so that it's the act of transferring the beverages and not the act of transporting. Because some states, for example, in California, you cannot impose a tax strictly on transportation. So you want to make sure that you define the distribution to be the transfer of the product. The other consideration is that some large businesses, especially grocery chains, distribute within their own business structure. So they have large warehouses that store their stock from many different stores, and then they simply make an intra-company transfer of the beverages to their retailers. So you want to also make sure that if you want to tax the distributors, that you define distribution to include those intra-company transfers as well, even though there's not separate money payment being transferred. So what are the advantages of taxing the distributors rather than the retailers? Well, one of them is probably a political advantage because taxing retailers can be seen more as hurting small businesses in the community rather than distributors, which are in many cases larger companies. And also distributors, there are fewer distributors in the community than there are retailers. So in terms of administering the tax, there are fewer taxpayers to collect from, identify, and collect from, although they might be more difficult to identify, but there are fewer of them than there are retailers, and presumably they would also have the capacity to be able to calculate the taxes as well, especially if they deal primarily in beverages. If you do decide to take an approach to tax distributors rather than retailers, there's another consideration, and that is many retailers, especially small businesses, will travel outside of city limits to, say, a Costco or a Sam's Club or a warehouse to purchase the stock for their store and then come back into the city to sell the stock that they purchased within their own store. And in that case, there has not been a traditional distribution within the city. There's been no distribution or dropping off of the beverages at the store. The store owner simply went to a neighboring city and bought them at Costco. In that case, if you want to capture that distribution, then you're going to actually have to impose a tax on the retailer or not capture that distribution. Those are the two choices. So your consideration if you want to tax distributors are many-fold, and I think, as I said, should be done in consultation not only with local counsel, but also should think through all the different ways that beverages get onto the store shelves within your community and make sure that your definition of distribution captures all of those ways that the beverages get on the shelves. The last thing I'll mention, we put in this guide because it's not uncommon to see in local taxes, and that is an exception for small businesses. That is not a legal requirement in most cases, although again you need to check with legal counsel, but it is a political and policy calculation if you feel that the way you've defined distribution might impact small businesses disproportionately and you want to not have that become a political issue. That's something to consider as well. So that is the end of that topic, and I believe the next one is for Jim.
Okay, next slide, please, David. Thank you. So this is our last slide, and then we'll move into some discussion and try to address all the questions that are popping up in the comments section, because there's some great ones there. So the last question is, okay, so you've done all this work where you figured out who to tax if it's a distributor, and you figured out what your tax rate's going to be and what your tax basis and what your products are. What do you do with the money? And this has both some policy implications and political implications that come right to the forefront of all these discussions. So the bottom line of the guidance that we've prepared is we recommend that, to the extent possible, that the revenues be dedicated or earmarked to a specific fund, not going into sort of a general tax fund, and that the funds in this dedicated fund be used to, at least in part, address the harms caused by sugary drinks, namely elevated rates of obesity, diabetes, other chronic conditions. That establishes a tight legal nexus between the imposition of the tax and the purpose of the tax, and that in turn makes it more immune to legal challenge, but also it just makes good policy sense, and it makes it easier to explain the rationale for the tax to the policymakers and to the public. That said, in some jurisdictions, it might not be legally feasible to earmark taxes or dedicate them, or as an example of California, through the initiative process, it might require a larger 2/3 vote to dedicate a tax than to have it go to general revenue, where it only requires a majority vote. So again, echoing the comments that Ian made, it's important to understand local tax law or state tax law and discuss this with your counsel to understand the implications of your choices. Regardless of whether the funds are earmarked or not, a second possibility that can be written into the tax bill in parallel is setting up some sort of expert panel or advisory group that can include representatives from community-based organizations, medical and public health experts from other potential stakeholders such as school districts who might be using the revenue funds to advise those who have the statutory authority to distribute the revenues, oftentimes the city council or legislature. And in some cases, this generally will be advisory, but it's a way to provide public visibility and accountability to have the funds go to appropriate targets. It's interesting to observe in the current range of tax proposals in 2016, say, for example, in Illinois and in Philadelphia most recently, given the budget pressures faced by many state and local governments, there's a great interest in just using the sugary drink tax as a revenue generator to either go in the general fund or support things that traditionally wouldn't be considered chronic disease prevention, such as supporting the state Medicaid program in the case of Illinois, or supporting, in the case of Philadelphia, child care and jobs programs and parks and recreation facilities. So I think it's interesting to think about the frame of social determinants of health and thinking more broadly of, can these funds be invested to help promote healthier communities in the broad sense, where the many factors that influence health could be addressed through these revenues, such as child care, for example, or such as parks and recreation facilities. So again, I think the bottom line here is that the idea of dedication is critical, but what the funds are dedicated to is going to be an intense local or state political discussion, and that will be determined more often than not in a case-by-case kind of basis in each location. So I think that is the key points here. So I think now we'll just open it up to general questions and discussions. We have a number of comments and questions in the parking lot, so maybe Ian, you and I can start walking down those and starting to address some of them. I think we've addressed some of them already through some of our comments. The first question I'd like to hold to the end is what are the first steps to organize a tax measure, and we'll come back to that. But maybe, Ian, the next question is from Jen about the legal considerations in requiring or recommending pass-through.
Yeah, the pass-through issue is it's a very interesting question that I had not considered until I started doing sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, because in some ways what we have said would be preferable is an excise tax on businesses that sell the beverages. That is, we're taxing the industry and not the consumer, because we don't want to unduly burden the consumer in some cases. But the pass-through attempts to sort of do both. That is, tax the industry, but actually end up making a higher price for the consumer in the hopes that consumer demand will go down. So it's been an interesting thing to wrap my head around. But that notwithstanding, there are also some legal issues that I think are important about the pass-through. And I'll just give you one example. If a local government here in California, just to draw upon where I'm very familiar, all of the local taxes, sales taxes in California have to mirror the state sales tax. And if they do, then the state collects them. But local sales taxes are otherwise preempted in California for specific products. So you can't do a local sales tax on sugar-sweetened beverages as a city or county government. But you could do a local business license tax, which is a form of an excise tax on sugary drinks. But in California, if you did a local excise tax and then had a mandatory pass-through, I think there's an argument that might convert that excise tax into a sales tax, because ultimately you're requiring that it be imposed on consumers. And since local sales taxes are preempted in California, that would at least, I don't know how a court would rule on that, but it's something that I could certainly see coming up. So that's one of the legal considerations, and I'm sure in other states there are other considerations as well. Most notably for local governments, it would be whether or not the enabling legislation that enabled the local government to do the tax initially allowed for the pass-through.
Great, thanks, Ian. I'll move on to the question from Vish. This comes up fairly often about artificially sweetened, non-nutritive sweeteners in products. In general, every tax bill that's been proposed thus far has excluded the diet products from, in the United States that is, from taxation, with the argument that they don't contain the substance of concern, which is added sugars. Partly that's because I think there is mixed evidence and some uncertainty still remaining about the health effects of the artificial sweeteners, and I think the jury is still out. I think my recommendation now, and best public health practice, is that from a harm reduction strategy on balance, if you had to choose between drinking a diet soda and a soda, the diet soda might be a harm reduction strategy. However, it's much better to drink low-fat, unsweetened milk products, water, unsweetened teas and coffees, and not drink diet products because the health effects are still uncertain. We mentioned, we hit the next couple of questions. In terms of polling, again, as I mentioned, many of the polls have tested 1 cent versus 2 cents per ounce and have found not very much change in public support across the 2 different levels of taxation, but I think it remains an open question when that gets translated more explicitly into percent price increases or what it will do to the price. In the next question, is there an impact of the price on non-tax products after the tax took effect in Berkeley, in Mexico? In Mexico, the consumption of bottled water has gone up about 4%, at the same time that the consumption of sugary drinks has gone down by about 6 to 9% in Mexico. So it seems like there is a substitution to non-tax products, at least in the Mexican experience thus far. And the data from Berkeley are still forthcoming, but we'll be looking at that question later. The next question I see on the list is how to determine if you have distributors in your jurisdiction. I think there it's a question of just doing local research by looking up online who the distributors are and what their physical address is. You can also talk to retailers and ask them where they get their products from. Usually, in most jurisdictions, there's a limited set of distributors. Even in large cities, there are probably not going to be more than 30 to 40 distributors that come into play. There also is the issue, what about the distributors who are physically located outside of the city, but then distribute their products into the city? And in general, those distributors are also subject to the tax based on legal considerations. Ian, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that particular issue.
No, just that it depends on whether the distributor actually does something within the city. So if it doesn't matter where they're located as long as they are doing some activity such as transferring within the city. If they're wholly outside the city, like a Costco in the neighboring city, and the retailer just happens to go to them, then that distributor is outside of your ability to tax.
And then in some cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, in some cases then the legislation has been written to apply to that retailer because there has been no distributor tax paid at that point, in effect putting that retailer in the same class as a distributor.
Absolutely, you can do that, and that's probably recommended if you have a lot of retailers that might go outside of your city to buy their stock.
Okay, so and then the question that I skipped that was asked at the very beginning is what are the first steps to organize a possible sugar drink tax measure? So that's a great question. Actually, we will be distributing quite shortly what we call the roadmap to implementing and adopting sugary drink taxes, and it lays out the step-by-step process of what to think about when considering putting a tax into place. So that'll probably be the subject of another webinar, and it's probably too complicated to get into in the last minutes or two here. But it looks like it was from Gabriella. If you have more specific questions, please reach out to me and the rest of us at Healthy Food America. We're happy to talk about how that would be considered in your local jurisdiction. So with that, I'll turn it over to David to wrap up.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate your interest in this topic. A few little housekeeping things at the end here. This document that we are basing this webinar on is available on our website at healthyfoodamerica.org. There also will be a recording of this webinar available very shortly, also on healthyfood.org. And while you're there on our website, we'd love it if you would sign up for materials that we'll be putting out now. We're just getting underway with a research watch that will summarize research about once a month or so, and several other products like the roadmap for sugary drink taxes that Jen mentioned. So please do stay tuned, and thank you very much for attending. That concludes the program. Thank you.